She didn't knock. She didn't call out. She simply stood at his gate in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard, soaking wet, half frozen, staring at the most feared man in the territory, like he was the least frightening thing she'd ever survived. Elias Boone had turned away 16 women in 8 years. Daughters of senators. Widows with fortunes. Women so beautiful the cowboys stopped breathing when they passed. Every single one broke against him like water against stone. But this woman, this quiet, unremarkable stranger with mud on her coat and nothing in her hands, she didn't flinch. And that was the beginning of everything. If this story already has you hit that subscribe button right now, drop the name of your city in the comments below and stay with me all the way to the end. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning before Clara Vale rode to his gate, Elias Boone fired his 4th housekeeper in 6 months. Not because she stole anything. Not because she was lazy. He fired her because she left a bowl of wildflowers on the kitchen table. He stood in that kitchen for a long moment, staring at those flowers like they'd insulted him personally. Then he walked out to the yard, found old Hector, his longest-serving ranch hand, 22 years on the payroll, and said simply, "Tell Mrs. Pruitt to collect her wages and be gone before supper." Hector didn't ask why. After 22 years, he'd learned not to. He just nodded, turned, and muttered under his breath when Elias was far enough away. "Lord have mercy on the next woman who sets foot in this house." He had no idea how prophetic that was going to be. There were 2 kinds of stories people told about Elias Boone in the Wyoming territory. The first kind were the facts. 30,000 acres of prime grazing land carved out of nothing. 400 head of cattle. A crew of 62 men, all of them loyal enough to ride into hell if Elias gave the order. A ranch house so large and well built, it had stood through 3 brutal winters without a single board warping. A man who'd started with nothing at 23, and by 38 had become one of the most powerful landowners in the West. The second kind of stories were the ones people told quietly in saloons around campfires, in the back rooms of general stores. The ones that explained why a man with all of that still ate supper alone every night. Why the big house had 11 rooms, and only 2 of them were ever used. Why every woman who came courting left within days, sometimes within hours, and none of them ever said why. Those stories started with a woman named Josephine Hartley, but nobody said that name out loud anymore. Not around Elias. King, the 11th woman. Nobody actually kept official count. But Hector did privately in a little leather journal he kept in his breast pocket. Arrived in late September on a private coach sent by a Denver banker named Aldous Fitch. Her name was Margaret. She was 26 years old, educated at a finishing school in Philadelphia, dressed in clothes that cost more than most cowboys earned in a year. She arrived with 2 trunks, a lady's maid, and a letter of introduction from her father, describing her as a woman of exceptional refinement and considerable patience. Hector watched her climb down from that coach and thought maybe this one. She looked sturdy enough. Sensible eyes, not the kind to collapse over a bit of mud. He was wrong. It took Margaret exactly 40 minutes. 40 minutes. From the moment Elias walked into the sitting room, dusty from the range hat, still on his head, not bothering to change, to the moment she looked at him and said in a voice stripped of every pretense, "Mr. Boone, is this genuinely how you intend to present yourself to a prospective wife?" The room went absolutely still. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Not with anger, not with embarrassment, with something far worse, total absolute indifference. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "This is how I intend to present myself every day for the rest of my life. If that troubles you, I'd suggest departing before the road freezes." She was back in that coach before the hour was up. Hector marked it in his journal. 11. 40 minutes. Personal grooming. Word traveled fast in that part of Wyoming. By October, even the most ambitious families in the territory had quietly crossed Elias Boone off their lists. No father with any affection for his daughter would willingly send her into that house. No matchmaker with a reputation to protect would waste her credibility arranging another introduction that would end in the same silent disaster. Which meant Elias Boone had essentially won. He'd built his fortress so effectively, so completely, that no one even tried to breach the walls anymore. He told himself he was relieved. At night, sitting beside a fireplace, large enough to heat a small church, in a house big enough to swallow 3 ordinary families, he told himself the quiet was a choice he'd made, and a choice he'd stand by. He was very, very good at believing his own stories. The blizzard came in off the mountains faster than anyone expected that November. By 4 in the afternoon, the sky had turned the color of iron, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in less than an hour. Elias was out with a crew, pushing 140 head of cattle to the south pasture shelter, and by the time they finished, the storm had swallowed the mountains whole, and the wind was the kind that didn't howl so much as scream. He rode back to the ranch house, cold to the bone, and in a mood that matched the weather. He was thinking about the cattle count, the east fence line that needed repair before the worst of winter set in, the feed costs he needed to review before the end of the month. He was not thinking about anything soft or human or complicated. That was his habit. That was his discipline. Fill the mind with work, and the work would keep everything else out. He rode through the main gate and nearly missed her entirely. She was standing just inside the gate against the left post, out of the worst of the wind. A bay horse beside her, a plain working animal, not a fancy horse, a horse that had covered real miles. The woman herself was in a canvas coat that was doing its best, and losing her hat pulled low, and she was just standing there, not waving him down, not calling out, just standing. Elias pulled his horse up and looked at her. She looked back. That was the whole of it for a long moment. The wind screaming around them, the snow coming sideways, and a strange stillness between two people who'd never laid eyes on each other before. He spoke first. "This is private property." "I know," she said. Her voice was calm. A little rough from the cold maybe, but calm. "I wasn't sure you'd let me in." "I haven't yet." "No," she agreed. "You haven't." He studied her. She wasn't young exactly. He put her somewhere in her early 30s, though the cold made it hard to read. She wasn't dressed for impressing anyone. There was nothing about her posture that suggested she was performing anything angling for anything preparing a speech. She looked tired. She looked cold. And she looked like a woman who had decided some time ago that there was no point pretending she wasn't both of those things. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Laramie," she said. "Before that, Missouri." "Long ride?" "Yes." "Where are you going?" A pause, short but real, like the honest answer required a breath to get behind it. "I don't know yet," she said. "I was hoping to find work, somewhere quiet." Elias looked at her horse, looked at her coat, looked at the sky which was currently delivering the clearest possible message about the next 12 hours. "You can't ride anywhere in this," he said. "I know that too. Is there someone expecting you somewhere?" "No." He sat on his horse for another long moment. Behind him, he could hear 2 of his ranch hands hanging back waiting, watching, almost certainly exchanging glances he couldn't see. He hated being watched when he was making decisions. "There's a room at the back of the cookhouse," he said finally. "Nothing special. You can shelter there until the storm passes." She nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Boone," he said. Something crossed her face, too quick to read. "Clara Vale," she said. He turned his horse toward the barn and didn't look back, but he heard her follow. Big. The cookhouse room was cold, barely furnished, and smelled of old wood smoke. Hector's wife Alma, who cooked for the ranch and could be characterized as a force of nature in an apron, took one look at Clara Vale and had her sitting at the kitchen table with hot coffee and a bowl of beef stew inside of 10 minutes. Alma was not one for asking many questions, but she was very good at reading people. She watched Clara Vale eat that stew quietly, deliberately, without performing gratitude or making conversation, and thought, this woman has been alone for a long time. Not alone like lonely. Alone like someone who learned to take care of herself so completely that the presence of other people had become, if anything, somewhat startling. "Where are you headed?" Alma asked, refilling the coffee. "I'm not sure," Clara said. "I was told there might be work in this area. Ranches needing help. Cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing." "Who told you that?" "A woman in Laramie, at the boarding house." Alma was quiet for a moment. "You know whose ranch this is?" "I found out when I saw the gate." "And you still came in?" Clara looked at her steadily over the coffee cup. It was either that or ride through a blizzard in the dark. Alma almost smiled. Fair enough. Elias ate supper alone, as he always did in the large dining room that had never in the 8 years he'd owned this ranch been used for anything other than feeding himself and on occasion meeting with his foreman about business. He wasn't thinking about the woman in the cookhouse. He was doing his accounts. He was very deliberately doing his accounts and not thinking about anything else. Then Hector knocked and came in. "She's settled in the back room," Hector said. "Alma fed her." "Fine," Elias said without looking up. "Storm's going to go through the night. Roads will be impassable till at least midday tomorrow." "I know that." Hector stood there a moment. Elias could feel him standing there, could feel the particular quality of his silence that meant something was coming. "She didn't ask for anything," Hector said. "Just I wanted to mention that. Most people come to the gate with something they want. She just wanted out of the storm." Elias looked up from his ledger. "Your point being?" Hector shrugged. "No point, just an observation." "Keep your observations to yourself, Hector." "Yes, sir," Hector said, and left. Elias looked back at his ledger. He didn't retain a single number he read for the next 20 minutes. He didn't intend to speak to her again that night. He'd done his duty shelter from the storm a hot meal through Alma, a room. That was neighborly. That was sufficient. In the morning the storm would pass, and she would go wherever she was going, and that would be the entirety of Clara Vale's presence in his life. He was on his way back to the main house from the barn when he heard her. She wasn't talking. She was singing very quietly to her horse. Something he didn't recognize. An old song, low and simple. The kind of thing a person sings without really knowing they're singing it. Like breathing. Like habit. He stopped. He stood in the dark outside the barn door and listened to a woman sing to a tired horse in a blizzard, and he felt something move through him that he could not name and did not want to. He walked back to the house quickly. He was efficient about it. He didn't look back. The storm didn't pass by midday. It raged through the following night as well, piling snow against every structure on the ranch, dropping temperatures to the kind of cold that turned ropes stiff and made breath come out in clouds that hung in the air like smoke. Elias had weathered worse. His men knew what to do. The cattle were sheltered. The horses blanketed the pipes that could be wrapped were wrapped. But it meant Clara Vale was not going anywhere. On the second morning, Alma came to Elias at breakfast with a proposition. "I could use the help," Alma said, in her direct way that had never learned how to hedge anything. "My knees are bad, and I've got a ranch full of men coming in twice a day expecting hot food. The woman can cook. I watched her this morning. She works hard, and she doesn't complain, and she doesn't talk unless she's got something to say." Elias ate his eggs. "She's not staying. Storm says otherwise. The storm will break. And then she'll need somewhere to go," Alma said. "She's got no money and no position, and no one waiting for her anywhere. What do you want her to do, ride out into January, Wyoming alone?" Elias set down his fork. "That is not my problem." "It doesn't have to be," Alma said. "I'm just telling you what is. You need kitchen help. She needs work. The storm made the introduction. Everything after that is just practical." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Temporary," he said. "Of course," Alma said. He told himself it was practical. He was very, very good at telling himself things were practical. Clara Vale worked. That was the first thing, and it was the thing that registered before anything else, because on a working ranch, the way a person met labor was the most fundamental truth about them. You couldn't fake it. You couldn't perform it for long. Either a person had the discipline to do hard work in hard conditions, without drama, or they didn't. Clara did. She was up before dawn. She didn't ask for direction she didn't need. She didn't fill the kitchen with chatter when chatter wasn't useful. She fixed what was broken, cleaned what was dirty, and when she finished one task, she moved to the next without being told. The ranch hands noticed within 2 days. "That woman doesn't waste a single movement," one of them, a young hand named Pete Calloway, said to another at the bunkhouse supper table. "Reminds me of a good working dog, except she's a person, and I mean that as a compliment." "Better not say that to her face," said the other. "Better not say that to the boss," said a third. "He already looks at her different." "He doesn't look at her at all," Pete said. "That's what I mean," said the third man, and went back to his food. Falsata. Elias did not look at her. This was intentional, deliberate, and required considerably more effort than anything he would have admitted to any living person. He noticed things, though. The way the kitchen smelled different in the morning, better warmer something baking that Alma never made. The fact that the common room, which had been accumulating a particular kind of resigned neglect for years, had been quietly, systematically put right, not dramatically transformed, but simply made decent. Small things, things that shouldn't have registered. They registered. On the fourth evening, he came in from the range later than usual, and the main house was dark except for the kitchen. And when he pushed through the kitchen door, Clara was at the table with a cup of tea and a book reading by the lamp. She looked up. She didn't startle, didn't stand up quickly or put the book away or apologize for being there. She just looked at him, calmly, like a person who had long since made peace with whatever she was and didn't need the room's approval of it. "I hope that's all right," she said, meaning the kitchen, meaning the lamp, meaning her quiet presence in his space. "Alma said you don't come through here in the evenings." "I don't usually," he said. "I can go." He should have said yes. He had rehearsed saying yes in a vague sort of way during the ride back from the range. Instead, he heard himself say, "What are you reading?" She held up the spine, a collection of letters correspondence between naturalists from 40 years prior. He would not have guessed that. "Any good?" he asked. "Very," she said. "One of them writes about watching a hawk hunt. He writes about it like it's the most important thing in the world. Maybe it is." Elias stood there in his coat hat in his hand, looking at a woman who thought a hawk hunt might be the most important thing in the world. He should have said goodnight and gone to bed. He pulled out the opposite chair and sat down. Hey. They talked for an hour and a half. He did not realize it was an hour and a half until he looked at the clock and felt an actual physical shock at the time. It was not significant conversation on the surface of it. Cattle breeds, winter feed strategy. Whether the eastern breed stock his neighbor Haverford was experimenting with was worth the trouble. What the soil in this part of Wyoming would and wouldn't grow. But underneath all of it was something he couldn't quite categorize. She disagreed with him twice. Not aggressively, not performatively, just directly, calmly, with reasoning behind it. No woman had disagreed with him in years. Most people on this ranch didn't disagree with him. He was, after all, the one who owned it. But Clara Vale said, regarding the eastern breed stock, "I think Haverford might be onto something you're discounting, because you've already decided he's wrong." And she said it the way she might mention that the weather was cold, as simple fact, requiring no defense. He stared at her for a moment. "On what basis?" he said. "The numbers you told me," she said. "The weight gain you're describing sounds better than you're giving it credit for." He thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, which was irritating. "Possibly," he said. She nodded, picked up her book and said, "I'll let you get to bed. Thank you for the company." She was gone before he'd formulated a response. He lay awake for a long time that night, not because of the breed stock argument, because of the quality of that hour and a half. He tried to name what it was. He was methodical about it the way he was methodical about everything. He examined it from different angles. And what he eventually arrived at, reluctantly, in the dark of his room with the wind still going outside, was this: she had not been performing at him. Not once in an hour and a half of conversation had she angled for anything. Had she said anything designed to impress him? Had she managed the conversation in any visible way? She had simply been a person talking to another person in a kitchen. He hadn't had that, not in years, not since he shut that thought down before it could develop. He turned over and made himself sleep. By the end of the second week, Clara Vale was not going anywhere, and they had both stopped pretending she was about to. Alma had quietly moved her from the cookhouse room to one of the smaller bedrooms in the main house, citing the cold. Elias had not objected, which Hector noted in his private journal with a small asterisk. The evenings in the kitchen became a pattern. Not a planned one. Neither of them ever said, "Let's do this again tomorrow." It simply kept happening. Elias came in from the range. Clara was usually in the kitchen at some point. They talked. sometimes for 20 minutes. Once for nearly 3 hours during a conversation that began with spring planting schedules and went somewhere he still couldn't fully account for. The ranch hands had entirely stopped pretending they weren't watching. Pete Calloway had started a quiet wager in the bunkhouse. The odds were shifting daily. Mag. Then came the evening that changed everything between them, though neither would have been able to say exactly how it started. He'd come in rougher than usual. There'd been a confrontation on the East Range, a neighboring outfit pushing cattle onto his land. Again, a recurring problem with a rancher named Galt, who seemed to have decided that Elias's fence line was more of a suggestion than a boundary. He'd dealt with it, but he'd dealt with it on the sharp edge of his temper, and he was still carrying that temper when he came through the door. Clara was at the kitchen table. She took one look at him and said nothing. Just got up, poured coffee, set it in front of him, and sat back down. No questions, no commentary, no performing concern. He sat there for a few minutes, letting the worst of it drain away, and she let him. Then he said, without really planning to, "When I was 25 years old, there was a woman who told me that the thing she loved most about me was that I was going to be someone important someday." Clara was quiet. "She meant it as a compliment," he said. "I thought it was at the time. It took me a long time to understand what she was actually saying." "What was she saying?" Clara asked. "She was saying she didn't love me," he said. "She loved the idea of what I was going to become. She loved what I could give her. And when she realized that becoming someone important meant years of mud and debt and weather and loneliness before any of the good parts arrived, she made a different choice." Clara held her coffee cup in both hands. She was looking at him steadily, the way she looked at things directly, without flinching, without performing any particular reaction. "When did she go?" Clara asked. "March of 1874, he said, 3 days after the worst blizzard I'd ever seen. I had 40 head of cattle dead a barn that was half collapsed, and I was so deep in debt I couldn't see daylight. I came back to the house and she was packed." He stopped. He hadn't said any of this out loud in over a decade. "She said she was sorry," he continued. "She said it wasn't what she'd expected. I asked her what she'd expected and she couldn't answer. I don't think she knew." "What did you do?" Clara asked. "I told her to take the horse and go," he said. "And then I went back out to the barn and I worked until I couldn't feel my hands." The kitchen was very quiet. "Is that when you stopped letting people in?" Clara asked, and something about the directness of it, the simple, unadorned accuracy of it, hit him like a fist. He looked at her for a long moment. "When did someone last ask you something like that?" he said. She held his gaze, and something moved through her face that he recognized because he'd felt it himself, the particular expression of a person who has been seen when they were trying very hard not to be. "I'm not sure anyone ever has," she said quietly. He sat with that. Then he said carefully, like a man crossing uncertain ground, "When was the last time someone truly saw you?" She looked down at her coffee cup. And when she looked back up, her eyes were bright in a way she was very clearly willing herself to control. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe tonight." He did not sleep at all that night. And downstairs in her small room, neither did she. And in the bunkhouse, Pete Calloway collected his winnings from 3 men who had bet against the odds. Neither of them mentioned the conversation the next morning. That was the agreement they hadn't spoken aloud, that whatever had passed between them in the kitchen the night before existed in its own separate space, and daylight required them to behave like 2 sensible adults who had simply shared coffee and ordinary words. Clara was up before dawn, same as always. Elias was out the door before the sun broke the ridge, same as always. But Alma noticed that he'd taken his coffee standing at the kitchen window instead of at his desk, and that he'd stood there longer than the coffee required. And Clara noticed that his cup was still on the windowsill when she came in, placed there carefully, not left carelessly, and she picked it up and washed it without saying a word. Alma watched all of this and said nothing. She was a woman who understood that the most important things happening in a room were usually the things nobody was talking about. By mid-morning, the storm had finally broken. The sky went clean and hard and blue, and the snow on the ground caught the light and threw it back like glass. The roads were passable by afternoon. Clara did not ask about leaving. Elias did not mention it. That silence was its own kind of answer, and they both knew it, and neither of them was ready to look at it directly. So they didn't. Instead, Elias spent the day on the East Range, dealing with the Galt boundary problem, in a more permanent way, setting a new fence line with 3 men, and making certain it was visible enough that nobody could claim confusion. And Clara spent the morning in the kitchen, and the afternoon doing something that stopped Hector cold when he walked past the south side of the house. She was clearing a patch of ground beside the barn wall. Not dramatically, not with great ceremony. She had a hand spade, and she was working methodically, removing rocks, loosening the frozen top layer of soil, doing the slow, thankless work of preparing ground that hadn't been touched in years. Hector stood and watched her for a moment. "Ground's too hard to plant anything," he said. "This time of year." "I know," Clara said without stopping. "But it won't be forever." He didn't have an answer for that. He walked on, but he wrote it in his journal that evening. "She's planning ahead. First one who ever did that." Hug. The conversation with Galt's man on the fence line had put Elias in a controlled fury all day. Not the hot kind. Elias didn't do hot fury anymore, hadn't in years. His anger had aged into something cold and efficient, the kind that got things done without wasted motion. But when he rode back and saw the cleared ground by the barn wall and understood immediately what she'd been doing, something shifted in him that had nothing to do with fences or property or anything practical at all. He unsaddled his horse. He didn't go directly to the house. He walked over to the cleared patch and stood there looking at it. The work was careful, thorough. She hadn't done it quickly, she'd done it right. "It gets afternoon sun from that wall," Clara said behind him. He turned. She was standing a few feet away, coat still on, hands dirty from the work. "Herbs mostly," she said. "Some kitchen things, maybe something that flowers if the season's long enough. I should have asked first. If you'd rather I didn't—" "It's fine," he said. A pause. "You sure?" He looked at the ground again, looked at the work she'd done. "Nobody's ever planted anything here," he said, "the whole time I've owned this ranch." She looked at him carefully. "Does that bother you?" "No," he said. Then after a moment, "Maybe it should have." She didn't respond to that. She just nodded once. The way she received things she understood, without drama, without filling the space around them with noise. "Supper's in an hour," she said. "Alma's knee is giving her trouble, so I've got the stove." She walked back toward the house. He stood by the cleared ground for another full minute before he followed. Supper that night had 12 men around the long kitchen table. The full indoor crew, since the cold had driven everyone in early, and Clara had made enough food for twice that, which was its own kind of miracle, given what she'd had to work with. The men ate with the focused appreciation of people who are genuinely hungry and genuinely grateful, which was the best kind of audience for a meal. There was a roast that had been going since noon bread, that had come out of the oven an hour ago, potatoes done in a way that young Pete Calloway declared were the best thing I've eaten since my mother's kitchen and possibly better. Clara took that compliment with a nod and kept moving, refilling, clearing, steady as she always was. Elias watched her work. He'd eaten at the head of the table, same as always, but for the first time in as long as he could remember, the room didn't feel like a place he was tolerating. It felt occupied, full of something other than just bodies and noise. After the men cleared out and Alma went to rest her knee, it was just the two of them again. Clara washing up Elias at the table with a cup of coffee he kept forgetting to drink. "Pete Calloway's right," he said. "That was a good meal. It was mostly what was available," she said. "That's what cooking is," he said. "You work with what's in front of you." She glanced over her shoulder at him. "Is that what you think cooking is?" "Isn't it?" She turned back to the washing up. "I think cooking is deciding that whoever's sitting at your table is worth the effort. The ingredients are just ingredients." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous philosophy," he said. "It's a practical one," she said. "People eat better when they feel like somebody gave a damn about the meal." He thought about 11 women who'd arrived at this ranch and left it. He thought about how many of those women had ever sat down with his ranch hands at a long table and served them roast and fresh bread. Not a single one. It wasn't a judgment he'd consciously made, but it landed in him like one. "Clara," he said. She paused at the sink. "Why Missouri?" he said. "What was in Missouri?" The pause was short, but it was real. My husband's family, she said. He went very still. Was, she said. Past tense. He died 2 years ago. I'm sorry, he said. She turned around and leaned against the counter. Her expression was not grief, it was something more complicated than that, more honest. Don't be, she said. Not on his behalf. He was a man in a great deal of pain, and I couldn't help him, and I tried for 4 years, and I couldn't, and he died still in that pain, and I have made my peace with what that means about me and about him. Elias looked at her. They blamed you, he said. It wasn't a question. He'd heard the particular flatness in her voice that people develop when they've repeated a version of a story enough times that it's stopped being capable of surprising them. His family did, she said. The town did mostly. The story was easier if it was my fault. Quiet women make convenient villains. What was the actual story? He said. She held his gaze. He was broken before I met him. He hid it well for a while. When he stopped hiding it, he stopped being able to hold anything together, and nothing I did or didn't do was going to change the course of what was already in him. I know that now. It took a long time to know it, but you left before you knew it. I left, she said carefully, because staying was ending me, because I'd made myself so small trying to manage his pain that I'd nearly disappeared entirely, and one morning I woke up and I didn't recognize the person I'd become, and I thought if I stay much longer, there won't be enough of me left to leave. The kitchen was very quiet. So you came west, he said. So I came west, she said, looking for somewhere quiet enough to figure out who I actually was. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, turned it once, twice. A habit he had when his mind was working faster than he wanted it to. Have you figured it out yet? He asked. She looked at him steadily. I'm working on it. That night he went to bed at a reasonable hour. He was asleep in minutes, which had not happened in weeks. He didn't examine why. The following week arrived with the full ferocity of a Wyoming December, and whatever careful distance Elias and Clara had been maintaining was largely dismantled by the logistics of survival. This was the thing about hard weather and hard work, there was no room for performance. You showed up, you did what was needed, you trusted the people beside you to do the same. Clara showed up. Every day, without fail, without complaint. She also gradually, without making a production of it, started moving through the main house with the ease of someone who had quietly decided she belonged there. Not claiming it, never that, but ceasing to apologize for her presence in it, which was a different thing and a more significant one. Elias noticed because he noticed everything, and he said nothing, because there was nothing he wanted to say that would make the situation better by being said. On a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of December, he came back from the North Range to find Clara in an argument. Not a loud argument. Clara didn't do loud, but she was standing in the yard straight-backed and completely still, and the man she was speaking with was Randall Galt himself. Not one of his hands, but Galt in person, which was unusual. And the expression on Galt's face was the particular expression of a man who is accustomed to getting his way and is having a novel experience. Elias came up beside her without a word. Galt looked at him with the elaborate casualness of a man who is more rattled than he wants to appear. Boone, your girl here has some opinions about my cattle. She's not my girl, Elias said. And what cattle? 20 head drifted onto your south line this morning, Clara said to Elias, not taking her eyes off Galt. I saw them on my way back from checking the kitchen garden. They've been there at least 3 hours by the tracks. His rider was with them. Galt spread his hands. Cattle drift. It's winter. Your rider drifted too, Clara said. With them. Through a fence gap that wasn't there yesterday morning. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and edges. Elias looked at Galt. Galt was a broad man in his 50s, weathered in the specific way of men who'd spent their lives outdoors. And there was something in his eyes that had nothing to do with drifting cattle. Something calculating, measuring, trying to determine what this woman's presence here meant about Elias, and whether it changed anything. Get your cattle off my land by end of day, Elias said, and fix the fence you cut. And the next time you want to test my boundary lines, do me the courtesy of doing it to my face instead of sending 20 head to do it for you. Galt looked at Clara one more time. There was something in the look that Elias didn't like: a reassessment, a piece of information being filed away for later use. "Didn't know you had the woman keeping watch for you," Galt said, and the way he said it was friendly on the surface and not friendly underneath. "Now you do," Elias said. Galt tipped his hat at Elias pointedly, not at Clara, and rode off. Elias stood watching him go. "He'll be back," Clara said quietly. "He will," Elias agreed. "What else did you see out there?" "The fence was cut clean," she said. "Not broken, not weathered, cut. And his rider wasn't moving that cattle back when I came up on them. He was waiting." Elias looked at her. "How do you know cattle well enough to read that?" "My father ranched," she said. "I grew up watching how people move animals when they want to versus when they don't." Another thing he hadn't known. Another piece of her history arriving quietly without fanfare. "Thank you," he said. He meant it simply. "You'd have found it yourself," she said. "Eventually," he said. "You found it faster." She said nothing to that, just turned and went back toward the house, and he stood watching her go with the distinct sensation of a man who is losing a battle he didn't fully realize he'd entered. "Bo." It was Hector who finally said it out loud. They were in the barn on a Friday evening, Elias checking a horse that had been favoring its left foreleg, Hector holding the lamp and being useful, when Hector said carefully, in the particular tone of a man who has chosen his moment with deliberation, "You haven't talked about sending her on." Elias kept his eyes on the horse's leg. "She's working. Alma needs the help." "That's not what I said." "It's what I answered." Hector was quiet for a moment. 22 years, Elias. 22 years I've worked for you, and I've watched 11, 12, counting the one from Denver, that Alma never told you about 12 women come through that gate. Not one of them ever made it past a week." "Your point." "She's been here 3 weeks," Hector said. "And the house feels different. The men are—" He searched for the word. "Easier. Like the place has stopped holding its breath." Elias straightened up, looked at Hector. "Don't," he said. "I am not saying anything," Hector said with the innocence of a man saying quite a lot. "She's a housekeeper," Elias said. "She needed work. The situation suited both parties. That's the whole of it." Hector nodded slowly, said nothing. "Write whatever you want in that journal of yours," Elias said. "But keep it to yourself." He walked out of the barn. Hector waited until he was out of earshot. Then, very quietly to himself, "Right." He marked the date in his journal with 2 asterisks. That night was the first night they argued. It was small on the surface of it. Clara had rearranged the order in which the supply inventory was done, a practical change, a better system than the one they'd been using, and one of the hands had followed her new process instead of the old one, which had caused a minor confusion with an order that hadn't gone out. Elias came in from dealing with it and found Clara in the kitchen and said sharper than he'd intended, "The supply process exists the way it does for a reason. Changes need to go through me." Clara set down what she was holding, turned around, looked at him. "The process wasted 2 hours a week," she said. "The new system is better." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" "The point," he said, "is that this is my ranch." The kitchen went very still. Clara held his gaze. "I know that," she said. "Then act like it." He regretted it the moment it was out. Not because it wasn't true, it was his ranch, but because of what it sounded like, what it reduced her to, and he could see in her face the precise moment it landed and what it cost her. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "You know, the last man who talked to me like that thought he owned me too, not just the property." The silence after that was a different kind entirely. "That's not what I meant," he said. "I know it isn't," she said, "but it's what came out." He stood there. He was not a man who apologized easily, not because he was too proud to mean it, but because the mechanics of apology had always felt inadequate to him. Words for what words couldn't fully carry. But he said, "You're right about the process. It is better. I should have started there." She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she did, like she was seeing past the surface to whatever was actually happening underneath. "Why does control matter so much to you?" she said. And the question was so direct and so accurate that he had no prepared answer for it, which almost never happened to him. "Because everything I have," he said slowly, "I built myself, and the only way I knew how to keep it was to keep my hands on every piece of it." "That's how you build something," Clara said. "But it's also how you stay alone in the middle of everything you built." He looked at the floor, looked back up at her. "I've been told that before," he said. "By who?" she asked. "Myself," he said. "Mostly in the middle of the night." Something shifted in her face. Something softened, not in a weak way, softened the way things soften when they recognize something true. "That's the loneliest kind of conversation," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." They stood there in the kitchen, the argument fully over, replaced by something rawer and more honest than the argument had ever been. "I'll talk to you before I change anything else," she said finally. "And I'll listen," he said, "before I react." She nodded. He nodded. He went to bed. She stayed in the kitchen for a while, and when she finally went to her room, she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, and she pressed both hands flat against her knees, and she thought, "Be careful. Be so careful. You know what it feels like when a man becomes necessary to you, and you know what that has cost you before." But her hands were shaking slightly, and she couldn't make them stop. The moment that broke something open in both of them arrived on a Thursday, 26 days after Clara had walked through the gate in a blizzard. Elias was sick. Not dramatically sick. Not the kind of sick that called for a doctor. But he'd come in from 3 days of hard riding in brutal cold with a fever and a chest that sounded wrong, and Alma took one look at him and sent him to bed with the authority of a woman who has been mothering large men into common sense for 30 years. He went. Which was itself a sign of how bad he felt. Clara brought him broth around midday. He was awake, propped up against the headboard, looking like a man who was furious at his own body for its inconvenient timing. "I don't need that," he said. "Nobody needs broth," Clara said. "But you're going to have it anyway." She set it on the table beside the bed and stood there. He looked up at her. The fever had taken some of his edges off, not completely, but enough that the thing underneath was a little more visible. The exhaustion. The age of carrying everything alone. "How long since you were sick last?" she asked. He thought about it. 4 years, maybe. Something in my chest then, too. "And who took care of you?" "No one," he said. "I managed." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's a sad thing to be proud of," she said. "It's not pride," he said. "Then what is it?" He picked up the broth, drank some of it not because he'd decided she was right, but because it was hot, and he was cold, and his body had taken the choice away from him. "It's just true," he said. She sat down in the chair across from the bed. She had a book, same naturalist letters, she was working through them slowly, and she opened it. "What are you doing?" he said. "Reading," she said. "Here. Alma's knee is bad. Somebody should be close by in case you need something." He looked at her for a moment, at a woman sitting in a chair in his room with a book completely unself-conscious about it doing the simple, unshowy thing of just being present. He could not remember the last time someone had simply stayed. He didn't say anything. He finished the broth, he lay back, he lay, and Clara read by the window while he slept. And for the first time in longer than he could honestly calculate, Elias Boone did not feel entirely alone inside his own house. He woke up in the late afternoon to find her gone and a second cup of broth on the table beside him still warm. He lay there staring at the ceiling for a long time. He was not a man given to sentiment. He had trained that out of himself with years of deliberate, methodical practice. But there was something about waking up to evidence that someone had thought of him while he slept, the simple, quiet fact of warm broth on a table, that undid something he couldn't immediately name. He got up. He felt better than he had any right to, after only a few hours. He dressed, went downstairs, and found the kitchen busy with supper preparations, and Clara in the middle of it, sleeves rolled up, moving between the stove and the table, with that particular efficiency of hers that wasted absolutely nothing. She glanced at him when he came in. "You should be in bed." "I'm fine," he said. "You were running a fever 4 hours ago." "I'm aware of that," She looked at him for a moment with the expression of a woman deciding whether to push a point. She decided against it, which he was beginning to understand was itself a form of strength, knowing when a battle wasn't worth the ground it would cost. "Sit down at least," she said. "Supper's almost ready." He sat. He watched her work. And he thought about what she'd said 2 days ago. That's how you stay alone in the middle of everything you built. And he thought about how true it was, and how the truth of it had never bothered him until very recently. "Clara," he said. She didn't turn around. Why did you stay today in the room?" A beat of silence. She kept her hands moving. "Because you were sick and alone, and nobody should be both of those things at the same time. That's simple," he said. She turned around then, looked at him with those direct, steady eyes. "Yes," she said. "That's simple." He nodded once. He didn't say thank you, he couldn't make it come out the way he meant it. But she seemed to understand because she turned back to the stove and said, "I put dried thyme in that broth. Good for the chest." "It was," he said. "Good." She kept working. He kept watching her. And something between them settled like ground after a hard rain, looser somehow. Easier to move in. He was back on his feet fully by the following morning, which annoyed several of his ranch hands, who had privately hoped for at least one more day of Clara running the operation uncontested. She'd handled 2 supply decisions, one personnel dispute between a pair of hands who'd been feuding over a card game debt, and the daily logistics of a 60-man working ranch without raising her voice once. Pete Calloway told Hector at breakfast, "She's better at managing people than he is, and I will deny saying that if anyone asks." Hector wrote it in the journal anyway. What nobody talked about directly, but everyone noticed, was that Elias stopped barking. That was the clearest measure of change on a working ranch, not what the boss said, but the temperature it was set at. And somewhere between the 3rd week of December and the turn of the new year, Elias Boone stopped leading with the sharp edge of himself. He was still direct, still demanding. The standards hadn't changed. But the coldness had gone out of it, the way a fire changes when you stop using it as a weapon against the room and just let it give heat. The men didn't discuss it. They were practical people. They simply worked better, ate better, slept better, and were grateful without needing to understand why. But it was Clara's garden that started it, the argument that nearly ended everything before it properly began. January had bitten down hard, the kind of cold that turned the world silent and still. Clara had been going out every few days to check on the cleared ground by the barn wall, doing whatever small things could be done in frozen conditions to prepare it for spring. She'd talked Alma into ordering specific seeds through the supply chain, had written out a planting schedule that she kept on the back of a supply ledger, and had begun quietly and without announcing it to treat that patch of ground as a project she was invested in across a future she was assuming she would be present for. Elias saw the seed order. He came to her in the kitchen on a Wednesday evening with the ledger in his hand, and he put it on the table between them. "These are spring seeds," he said. She looked at the ledger. Looked up at him. "Yes. Spring is 4 months away." "I know when spring is," she said. "You ordered enough for a substantial kitchen garden," he said, "and herbs, and 3 varieties of flower." "The flowers are for the bees," she said. "Better bees, better cross-pollination on the kitchen crops. It's practical." "That's not the point," he said. "Then what is the point?" And there it was. Again the same tension as the supply argument, but bigger this time, because they both understood what was underneath it. Not the seeds, not the ledger. The assumption the seeds represented. That she would be here. That she was planning to be here. That they had both, without quite saying so, stopped treating her presence as temporary. "Clara," he said carefully, "we haven't talked about the arrangement. What it is, what it isn't." She held his gaze. Her jaw was set, but her voice was steady. "Are you asking me to leave?" "No," he said immediately. Too immediately. He heard it himself. "Then what are you asking?" He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. He put both hands flat on the table, a gesture she'd learned meant he was trying to be precise, trying not to break anything with careless words. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Do what?" "Whatever this is," he said. "Whatever is happening in this house. I don't have a framework for it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You don't need a framework. You need to be honest." "I'm trying to be honest." "Then try harder," she said. Not unkindly, just directly. He looked at her. At this woman who kept requiring him to be more precise than he was comfortable with, who kept refusing to let him hide behind vagueness or business language or the kind of gruff deflection he'd spent years perfecting. "I am afraid," he said, "that if I let this become what it's becoming, you will eventually leave, and I will have let something matter that I should have kept at a distance." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara sat with that for a moment. She didn't rush to reassure him. She didn't soften it or paper over it with easy words. She just let it be what it was. "And I'm afraid," she said finally, "that if I let this become what it's becoming, I will lose myself again. That I'll make myself small to fit into your life same as I did before. And one day I'll wake up and I won't know where Clara Vale ended and somebody's convenience began." He looked at her. "So we're both terrified," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's a remarkable amount of fear for two adults sitting at a kitchen table." Something cracked in her face. Not grief, not quite humor, but the specific expression of a person who laughs at exactly the right terrible moment because the alternative is crying. "It is," she said. "Isn't it?" He let out a breath. "What do we do with that?" She thought about it. Really thought he could see her working through it the way she worked through anything worth solving. "We could make rules," she said. "What kind of rules? Honest ones," she said. "No promises neither of us can keep. No pretending we know where this goes. No ownership of each other of what the other person becomes here. Just honesty, as we go, one day at a time." He turned that over. It was a more reasonable proposal than he deserved from a woman he'd given very little concrete reason to trust. "And the garden," he said. She met his eyes. "The garden is mine. Whatever else happens, I'm planting that garden." Something in him, something that had been rigid and defended and cold for nearly a decade, shifted, quietly. The way ice shifts in early spring, not dramatic, not visible from the outside, but real. "Plant your garden," he said. And that was the beginning of the rules they never wrote down, but both kept perfectly. February on the ranch was survivalist business. The cold was the kind that stripped everything to essential function: feed the cattle, keep the pipes clear, stay alive. Repeat. There was no room for pretense in February. You showed up for what mattered and let everything else go. What mattered, it turned out, included the kitchen fire and the long evenings, and the conversations that had become the structure around which both of them organized the rest of their days, without acknowledging they were doing it. Elias started talking more. This surprised him. He had never been a man who talked easily. He'd spent years in deliberate economy of words, training himself to say only what was necessary, and let silence do the rest. But something about Clara's quality of listening made talking feel less dangerous than usual. She didn't complete his sentences. She didn't interpret him before he'd finished. She didn't receive what he said, and immediately offer her own parallel experience in return. The way people did when they were waiting to be heard rather than actually listening. She just listened, and occasionally she asked questions so precise they felt like she'd opened a door he hadn't known was there. On a Tuesday in the second week of February, he told her about his father. Not the whole story. He never told the whole story. There wasn't a version of it that came out evenly, but pieces of it. A man who worked himself into the ground and expected his son to watch and learn and inherit the lesson that the ground was what you were owed in the end. "Did he love you?" Clara asked. "Clara." "In his way," Elias said. "He showed up, he worked, he didn't leave. I think that was the whole of what he understood love to be." "Is that what you understand it to be?" she asked. He thought about it. "I used to," he said. "I'm not sure anymore." She was quiet. Then, "My mother used to say that love without words was just coexistence, that somebody had to say it out loud or it didn't count." "What do you think?" he asked. "I think she was half right," Clara said. "Words matter, but you can say every right word and mean none of them. I've heard it. I know what that sounds like." A pause. "And I know what it looks like when someone shows up in the dark and stays. That counts too." He looked at her for a long moment. She was looking at the fire, and the light caught the side of her face, and he thought with the quiet clarity of a man who has stopped lying to himself, "I am in trouble. The real kind. The kind that has no practical solution." He said nothing. She said nothing. But the air between them was different after that, and they both knew it, and they both let it be different without touching it. The twist came from outside the ranch, which Elias should have expected. Randall Galt had been quiet since November. Too quiet, as it turned out. At the end of February, a man named Sutter arrived in town, a land assessor from the territorial office. As he described himself, though, his credentials had a freshness about them that Hector, who'd dealt with more paperwork than most, found slightly suspicious. Sutter spent 3 days asking questions at the general store, the saloon, and the land registry office, and then on the 4th day, he rode out to the Boone Ranch with a document. Elias read the document standing in the yard, Sutter beside him. Clara 15 feet away, where she'd been checking the east fence schedule with Hector, and had gone still when she saw the assessor's coat. The document claimed an irregularity in the original land grant for the southeast quarter of Boone's holdings, approximately 6,000 acres, and opened a formal inquiry into the title. The inquiry was filed on behalf of a development interest out of Cheyenne, seeking to establish a rail corridor through the territory. Elias read it twice. His face showed nothing. That was the tell for people who knew him. When Elias went perfectly expressionless, something was very wrong. "Who filed this?" he said. "I'm not at liberty to disclose the filing party at this stage," Sutter said. "It's standard procedure." "Who filed it?" Elias said again, and the second time it wasn't a question. Sutter shifted his weight. "A syndicate. I don't have the specific names at this stage of the process." "When does the inquiry period close?" 60 days from filing date, Sutter said. February 19th was the filing date. "That gives you until April 20th, Elias said. "And if I can't demonstrate clear title in that time..." "The land reverts to territorial jurisdiction pending resolution," Sutter said. "Standard procedure." Elias handed the document back. "Get off my land." Sutter got. Elias stood in the yard for a moment after the man rode out. The cold was sharp and real, and he used it. Breathed it in, let it push everything to the surface clearly. Then he turned and walked to the house and found Clara already at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee and 2 cups. He sat down. She poured. He said, "What do you know about land title law?" "Some," she said. "My father had a dispute years back. Took 2 years to resolve. He won, but it took everything he had to fight it." "What did he need to win?" "Original documentation," she said. "The cleaner the chain, the better. Grant papers, survey records, any correspondence with the territorial office at the time of purchase." "I have all of that," Elias said. "I'm meticulous. My attorney in Laramie holds copies." "Then you should be able to challenge it," she said. "Yes," he said. "But 60 days is tight. And if someone is manufacturing a claim to force a sale..." He stopped. "The southeast quarter is where the best water runs on this land. Any rail corridor through there would also control the water access for 3 neighboring ranches." Clara looked at him over her coffee cup. "Including Galt's." "Including Galt's," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Galt's in debt," she said. He looked at her sharply. "How do you know that?" "Alma talked to the mercantile owner's wife," Clara said. "Last month when I went into town with her for supplies. His credit line was cut in December. He's been overextended for 2 years." A pause. A sale of that southeast quarter at territorial valuation would give him enough to clear his debts and probably buy back in as a minority partner of whatever corridor comes through. Elias stared at her. "You gathered all of that at the mercantile," he said. "People talk to women they think aren't paying attention," she said. He sat back in his chair. He looked at this woman across his kitchen table who had listened to ranch wives at a mercantile counter and come home with better intelligence than his foreman had managed in 6 months. "You are," he said slowly, "considerably more than I initially estimated." She picked up her coffee cup. "Most people are," she said. "You just have to stop looking at what they cost you and start looking at what they know." He held her gaze. Then he said, "I need someone I trust to go through the original grant papers with me. Someone who can look at what's there without assumptions." "I can do that," she said. "I know you can," he said. Not as a compliment, as a fact. She nodded. They went to work. They spent the next 4 evenings at the dining room table, the large room that had never been anything but empty and functional, going through every document Elias had, every letter, every survey, every territorial correspondence from the original land purchase in 1870. It was slow work, careful work, the kind of work that requires two sets of eyes that trust each other enough to disagree. They disagreed twice. Both times Clara was right about where to look deeper, and both times Elias conceded it without dragging the concession out. What they found on the third evening was both better and worse than expected. The title was clean. The documentation was complete and clear. The chain of ownership was unambiguous and correctly recorded at every step. But there was a gap, a 3-month period in 1871, where a temporary land agent had processed filings for the territorial office, and that agent's records were, according to the territorial registry, incomplete. It was a gap that shouldn't have mattered. But it was a gap that a sufficiently funded legal argument could turn into a question mark. "Someone paid to find that gap," Clara said, looking at the dates. "Someone paid to create it," Elias said. "Those records were complete when I last had them reviewed, in 1878. Clara looked up from the documents. "You think the records were altered?" "I think someone knew exactly where to apply pressure," he said. "And I think they had help inside the territorial office." The room was very quiet. Then Clara said, "Do you know anyone at the land office in Cheyenne?" "Someone above the filing level." "One man," Elias said. "Theodore Marsh. We came out together same year. I haven't spoken to him in 3 years. Can you reach him?" "I can try," he said. "Then try tomorrow," she said. "And in the meantime," she pulled a separate piece of paper toward her, one she'd set aside earlier. "These are the names on 3 other land grants from that same agent's processing period. If the records were altered for yours, they were altered for others too. Which means other ranchers have the same gap in their documentation and don't know it yet." He looked at the names she'd written. "That's every major ranch between here and the river corridor," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her, at the paper, back at her. "If they're all facing the same exposure," he said, "they have as much reason to fight this as I do. More in some cases," she said, "because some of them don't have lawyers in Laramie and documentation as solid as yours. They'll lose faster." He understood what she was saying. He understood it fully, and the weight of it, not just the legal fight, but the kind of thing it required of him, the reaching out to neighbors he'd spent years keeping at arm's length, settled on him heavily. "I'm not good at asking for help," he said. "I know," she said, "or coalition." "I know that too." A pause. He looked at the paper with the names on it. He thought about 6,000 acres, and the water that ran through them, and the 62 men whose livelihoods were tied to this land. "Who wrote those names?" he said. "I did," she said. "So you already decided what needs to happen," he said. She met his eyes steadily. "I decided what I thought needed to happen," she said. "You decide what you're going to do. That's the rule we agreed on." He was quiet for a long moment. "It's a good rule," he said. She said nothing. She started organizing the documents back into their proper order. He sat watching her hands steady, careful putting things right, and he thought about a woman who'd arrived at his gate with nothing, and had in 4 months become the person he trusted most in the world. He thought about rules they'd made: no promises, no pretending, no ownership, only honesty. He thought the rules are getting harder to live inside. "Clara," he said. She looked up. He had something to say. He could feel it pressing against the back of his chest, something that had been building for weeks and had no safe container. He opened his mouth. And then Hector knocked on the door and said through it, "Boss, Ryder at the gate. Says he's from Marsh's office in Cheyenne. Says it's urgent." Elias closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he stood up, pushed the chair back, and said, "Tell him to come in." He looked at Clara one more time before he went to the door. She was already folding the land names paper into her pocket. Of course she was. The rider's name was Calvin Drew, and he was 22 years old and had been riding since before dawn, and the first thing he said when he came through the door was, "Mr. Marsh sends his regards and says you need to get to Cheyenne before the end of the week." Elias took the letter the man handed him. Read it standing in the hallway, still in his coat. Clara stayed in the doorway of the dining room far enough to give him room close enough to read his face when he looked up. His face said it was bad. "What does he know?" Elias asked the writer. "More than he wrote down," Calvin said. "He said to tell you in person that the filing came through a Cheyenne attorney named Whitmore, who's done 3 prior land conversions for the same development syndicate. 2 of them never made it to dispute the ranchers sold before the inquiry closed. Mr. Marsh said the syndicate is counting on the same here. They're counting on me not having the time or resources to fight it properly," Elias said. "Yes, sir. That's what Mr. Marsh believes." Elias folded the letter, looked at Clara. She said before he could go, "I'll handle the ranch." "I'll be gone at least 4 days," he said. "I know how long Cheyenne is," she said. Something moved across his face, not quite relief, not quite the other thing, which was the part he wasn't ready to name. "The supply order from Haverford is due Wednesday," he said. "Tell them to hold the east delivery until I'm back. And the fence crew needs—" "Elias," she said. He stopped. "Go," she said. "I have it." He looked at her for one long moment, long enough that Calvin Drew found something very interesting to study on the opposite wall. Then Elias nodded once. "I'll leave at first light. Back." He left before she was up. She heard the horses in the yard in the dark before dawn and lay still in her room listening to the sound of him going, and she told herself the hollow feeling in her chest was just the cold. She got up. She ran the ranch. It turned out extremely good at running it. Not in the way Elias ran it, not with his particular authority, the decades of relationship and reputation that made men move when he spoke. But in her own way, the quiet, methodical way that got everything done without requiring anyone to perform obedience or fear. Hector told her on the second morning, "You know, most foremen would be insulted to have someone step in like this." "Are you insulted?" she asked. He thought about it. "No," he said. "Mostly I'm impressed, and a little bit jealous of how easy you make it look." She got the supply order sorted. She handled a dispute between 2 fence crews about overlapping assignments with a patience and clarity that left both crews feeling respected, which was harder than it sounded. She kept the books updated, the men fed the animals tended, and the daily operations of a 60-man working ranch moving without a single day lost. But the evenings were wrong. She didn't notice it at first, or rather she noticed but refused to name it. The kitchen was the same, the fireplace was the same. Everything was objectively unchanged. Except she was sitting in it alone, and the chair across the table was empty, and she'd been alone in kitchens for most of her adult life, and it had never felt like a subtraction before. On the 3rd night, she caught herself setting 2 cups out before she realized what she'd done. She stood there for a moment looking at the 2nd cup. Be careful, she told herself. Be so careful. Elias came back on the 5th day, late afternoon, trail dirty and drawn tight in a way that meant the trip had not gone entirely well and had also not gone entirely badly, which was sometimes the worst kind of outcome, because it left everything still unresolved. He came in through the kitchen. She was at the stove. He set his hat on the table and sat down, and she put coffee in front of him, without being asked, and he wrapped both hands around the cup and said, "Marsh confirmed it. Whitmore filed on behalf of a syndicate backed by 3 investors, one of whom is Randall Galt." "Galt is fronting money he doesn't have," Clara said. "The other 2 are covering him," Elias said. "Eastern money. They want the corridor. They want the water rights that come with it. And they have a lawyer who's done this successfully twice before in Nebraska territory." "What did Marsh say about the document gap?" "He's filing a counter notice on my behalf through the Federal Land Office, which buys more time. But he also said—" Elias stopped, set down the cup. "He said to prepare for the possibility that this goes to a formal hearing. And if it goes to a formal hearing, it becomes about who has better lawyers, not who has the cleaner title." Clara sat down across from him. "And they have better lawyers." "They have more money for lawyers," he said, "which is the same thing in practice." She was quiet for a moment. "The other ranchers. Did you contact them?" He looked at her. "You knew I would." "I hoped you would," she said carefully. "I sent letters from Cheyenne," he said, "to each name on your list. Marsh is helping coordinate. If we file a joint challenge all affected properties unified documentation, it changes the weight of the case considerably. A syndicate can outspend one rancher. It's harder to outspend 7. She let out a breath she'd been holding for days. That's good, she said. That's the right move. It was your move, he said. Those names. You made the letters happen, she said. He shook his head slowly. Clara, before I left in the dining room. The door banged open, and Pete Calloway came in from the yard with the energy of someone who has been waiting for this moment. Boss, you're back. We've got a situation with the north water line froze solid overnight, second time this week, and Hector thinks the pipe fitting's cracked, but Dawson says... Elias stood up. He looked at Clara. We'll finish that, he said. We will, she said. He went with Pete. She sat at the table alone and pressed her hands flat against the wood and thought about a dining room and an almost sentence and what it might have been heading toward. What happened over the following 2 weeks was this. The coalition of 7 ranchers began to take shape, and it required Elias to do the thing that was hardest for him, which was ask people for things. He was good at giving orders. He was capable of generosity when he chose it. But genuine asking coming to another person with a need that required their voluntary cooperation, that was different territory, and he moved through it with the careful deliberateness of a man who doesn't fully trust the ground under him. Clara watched him do it and understood what it cost him and said nothing about the cost. But once after a difficult meeting with 2 of the neighboring ranchers at their kitchen table, a meeting where Elias had done the asking and been met with suspicion, and had pushed through the suspicion patiently, and come out the other side with reluctant agreement. He came home and sat down, and just breathed for a moment, and Clara set a bowl of food in front of him, and sat across from him, and said, You did that well. He looked up. I know it wasn't easy, she said. I know asking isn't... She paused. I know what it cost. He held her gaze. How? Because you have the same face afterward that I used to have after asking my husband for permission to feel something, she said. That particular look of a person who has survived something they shouldn't have had to survive to begin with. He went very still. Asking shouldn't be surviving, she said quietly. That's what I had to learn. That needing help isn't a weakness to overcome. It's just... She searched for the word. Human. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, You are the most direct person I have ever met. Is that a complaint? She asked. No, he said. Not even close. The first week of March arrived with an unexpected break in the cold 3 days of warmer air that felt like a promise the land hadn't quite decided to keep. Clara's cleared ground by the barn was still frozen, but barely. She checked it every morning, pressing her fingers into the soil the way someone checks on a sleeping child, reading what was underneath. Elias started joining her, not with commentary, not with opinions about soil or planting schedules. He just came and stood beside her in the early morning while she checked the ground, and they talked about other things, the coalition, the legal timeline, the ranch operations, while her hands were busy with the earth. On the 3rd morning he said, watching her, It's going to work, you know. The garden, she said. Yes, he said. The garden. She looked up at him. He was looking at the ground, but his face was doing something complicated, and she understood that he was not only talking about the garden, and he understood that she understood, and neither of them said so directly. Spring's still a long way out, she said carefully. Not as long as it was, he said. She turned back to the ground. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. What she didn't tell him, what she hadn't told anyone, was that she'd received a letter. It came on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of March, routed through the Laramie post office to the Boone Ranch address, because the return address was Missouri, and the writer was her former mother-in-law, and it had taken 3 months to find her. The letter was 4 pages long, and it was the most thorough character assassination Clara had ever had the experience of reading about herself. Her coldness, her failure, her responsibility for what had happened to a man already broken before she met him, her selfishness in leaving, her indecency in starting over somewhere else when she should have spent the rest of her days in contrition. It closed with a warning. You do not deserve comfort or happiness, Clara. You destroyed my son. Anyone who takes you in will discover the same thing in time. She read it twice. She burned it in the kitchen fire on a Wednesday morning when no one was in the kitchen, but the words didn't burn. They sat inside her with the weight of things you know are false and can't quite make yourself fully disbelieve because they were said by someone who knew your worst moments, and even lies have more power when they're aimed at the specific shape of your old wounds. She became quieter. Just slightly, not enough for most people to notice. Elias noticed. Boy. He noticed on a Thursday evening when she gave shorter answers than usual. He noticed Friday when she was up even earlier than normal, busy with tasks that didn't strictly need doing. He noticed Saturday when she excused herself from their evening in the kitchen before the fire, saying she was tired, which was not impossible, but was also not quite consistent with what he read on her face. He didn't ask immediately. He'd learned that Clara Vale could not be pushed toward honesty. She arrived there herself, in her own time, and pressure only made her retreat further. But on Saturday night, he sat alone by the kitchen fire and thought about the quality of her recent silence versus her usual silence, and he understood they were different, and it worried him in a way he didn't have clean language for. On Sunday morning, he found her in the barn, brushing down her horse, and he recognized the quality of that particular activity, a person putting sustained physical attention on an animal they love, because the animal doesn't ask questions, and the work keeps the hands busy and the heart at manageable volume. He'd done it himself for years. "Clara," he said. She kept brushing. "Morning? What happened?" A pause in the brush strokes, just one. Nothing happened. "Something happened," he said. She turned around. She was holding the brush at her side, and her expression was the carefully managed one she'd had when she first arrived. The face of a woman who has practiced keeping things inside until she decides whether the outside is safe enough for them. "I got a letter," she said. "From who?" "My late husband's mother." He waited. It said the things people say when they need someone to blame, and you're the most available option, she said. It wasn't true, most of it. Most, he said. She looked at him directly. "There are always pieces that are true," she said. "I wasn't a perfect wife. I didn't manage his pain the way someone better might have. I failed him in small ways that I'll carry for a long time." A pause. "But failure is different from blame. And I know the difference. I know it here." She pressed her hand flat against her sternum. "But sometimes knowing something here doesn't stop it from hurting here." He took 2 steps and stood in front of her, not touching, just close enough that she had to look up slightly to hold his gaze. "She is wrong," he said. "I know that." "I want you to hear me say it," he said. "She is wrong about you. I have watched you every day for 4 months. I know who you are, and she is wrong." Clara's jaw tightened the way it did when she was keeping something in. Her eyes went bright. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't be kind to me right now." "Why not?" "Because I can handle being wrong. I can handle being blamed." She turned back to the horse. "I cannot handle being seen right now without—" She stopped. "Without what?" he said. She shook her head. "Clara, without what?" She turned back to him, and the controlled expression had slipped just enough. "Without falling apart a little," she said. "And I don't want to fall apart in front of you." "Why not?" "Because you need me functional," she said. "The ranch, the coalition, the legal fight." "Stop," he said. He said it firmly, but not harshly, the way he stopped a horse before it ran somewhere dangerous. "Stop doing that." She looked at him. "Stop making yourself useful as a reason to be here," he said. "That is not why I want you here." The barn was very quiet. "Then why?" she said. The question came out smaller than she meant it to. He stood there with the answer pressing against the inside of his chest, large and complicated, and not fully reducible to words. And then he said, the truest version of it he could find. "Because this place is different when you're in it. Because I'm different when you're in it. And that has nothing to do with cooking and coalitions, and knowing whose cattle are whose." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm afraid, Elias." "I know," he said. "So am I." "I can't disappear again," she said. "I can't make myself small again. If I feel myself starting to—" "You haven't," he said. "Not once." Not a single day have you made yourself small in this house." She shook her head slowly. "You don't see it yet," she said. "Because it's early. Because I'm still—" She stopped, found the word. "Still intact. But I know how it starts. I know how it starts, and I know where it ends, and I cannot do that again." He held her gaze. "What do you need?" he said. "Tell me exactly." She pressed her lips together. Thought. Then, "I need you to mean what you say. Every time. Not just when it's easy." "All right," he said. "And I need you to tell me when something's wrong before you've already decided to handle it alone," she said. "Because I can't be beside someone who disappears into himself every time something gets hard." "That's fair," he said. "And harder for me than it sounds." "I know it is," she said. "I'm asking anyway." He nodded once. "Then here's what I need," he said. "I need you to stop planning your exit before anything's actually gone wrong." She opened her mouth. "I see you doing it," he said. "I see you measuring the distance to the door. I understand why I understand every reason why. But I need you to stay in the room, even when it gets difficult." She closed her mouth. She looked at the ground. She looked back up. "That is also harder than it sounds," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm asking anyway." Something shifted in her face, slow like ice moving. Not all the way, but enough. "We're a pair," she said quietly. "Aren't we?" "Yes," he said. "We are." What happened 3 days later, Elias did not see coming. He should have, if he'd been paying attention with the part of himself that wasn't occupied with legal documents and coalition correspondence, and the careful management of everything he'd built. He might have caught the signs. But he was tired and stretched thin, and he made an error he would spend a long time not forgiving himself for. It started with something small. It always started with something small. A visiting rancher named Corbin came to discuss the joint filing, and Corbin was an old-school man, not a bad man, but a man firmly of his time. And when Clara came into the dining room with coffee, and Corbin said without malice to Elias, "Your woman keeps a good house. You're lucky to have her." Elias didn't correct him. He didn't say, "She's not my woman in the possessive sense you mean." He didn't say she makes her own choices. He didn't say anything because Corbin was an ally he needed, and the comment had been meant kindly, and the moment passed too fast, and he let it go. Clara, who had been setting down the coffee tray, went still for 1 second, that only someone watching very carefully would have caught. Then she finished what she was doing, and left the room without a word. Elias noticed the second the door closed. He felt it. But Corbin was talking, and the documents were on the table, and he stayed in that room for another 40 minutes, and by the time Corbin left, it was late, and the house was quiet, in the specific way that meant Clara had gone to bed. He told himself it would be fine. He'd explain in the morning. He'd tell her that Corbin didn't matter, and that he should have said something, and he was sorry he didn't. He told himself a lot of things. But just before midnight, he went past her room for a glass of water, and he saw the line of light under her door, and he heard very quietly the specific sounds of a person moving around a room in a deliberate, careful way. He knocked. Silence. "Clara," he said. "I'm tired," she said through the door. "Good night, Elias." The voice was even. That was the problem. Too even. The voice of a woman who has made a decision and is keeping herself level until she's through it. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went to bed. He did not sleep. At 3 in the morning, he got up and he went downstairs for water, and he passed the hallway outside her room, and on the floor beside her door was her traveling bag. Packed. Strapped closed. He stood looking at it for a long time. Something went through him that he hadn't felt since he was 25 years old and came home to a house with a packed trunk and a woman who couldn't meet his eyes. The specific cold of a man who has let himself believe and is watching that belief get ready to walk out the door. But this was different. This was not Josephine who had left because she'd chosen comfort over her word. This was Clara who was leaving because he'd stood in a room and let a careless man reduce her to a possession, and he hadn't said a single thing to stop it. He put his hand flat against her door. He stood there. Then he walked past and went outside into the March night, and the air was cold and sharp, and the sky above the ranch was so full of stars it looked unreal, and somewhere above the mountains there was thunder building a late-season storm, the kind that came out of nowhere. He stood in the yard. He thought about 8 years of fortress, about walls built so thoroughly they'd started to feel like home, about a woman who'd arrived with mud on her coat and nothing in her hands, and had somehow, without announcing it, become the person this whole enormous life of his couldn't run without. He thought, I have done something unforgivable, and the question is whether I will let pride keep me from fixing it. He was still standing there when Clara's light came on upstairs. He was still standing there when her window opened, and she looked out and saw him in the yard and went very still. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. The thunder moved closer, and Elias Boone, who had not asked another person for anything that cost him something real in nearly a decade, opened his mouth in the middle of a March night with a storm coming in off the mountains, and said, "Come down, please." The window was quiet for a moment. Then it closed. He waited. The door opened. She came down the porch steps in her coat, arms crossed over her chest. Expression guarded in a way she hadn't worn since the first week she'd arrived, and she stood 5 feet from him in the wind, with her bag still upstairs, and her whole body saying she was deciding something. "I should have said something to Corbin," he said. "I should have corrected him on the spot. I didn't, and I was wrong." "Why didn't you?" she said. "Because I was managing the alliance, and I let that be more important in the moment than what I owed you," he said. "That was a mistake." She looked at him. "It wasn't just Corbin," she said. "It was the feeling of being handled, of being useful and present and invisible at the same time. I know that feeling. I know exactly where it goes. I know," he said. "I didn't, Clara. I wasn't thinking of you that way. But I understand why it felt like that, and I can't tell you the feeling was wrong because you earned the right to that feeling." She shook her head slowly. "I was ready to leave," she said. "I had the bag packed by 10 o'clock. "I know," he said. "I saw it." "And," she said, "and I have been standing in this yard for an hour," he said, "trying to figure out what kind of man I want to be." He stopped. He ran a hand over his face, the gesture of a man who has run out of ways to manage what's coming. "I don't know how to love someone without being terrified they'll leave." The wind picked up. The first rumble of thunder rolled down from the mountains. Clara stood in it without flinching. "I know that," she said. "I've known that for months." "Then you know it doesn't mean I'll fail you," he said. "The fear isn't going anywhere, but it doesn't have to make my choices." She was quiet for a long moment. Her arms were still crossed, but something in her posture had changed slightly, fractionally, like a door that stopped being held shut from the inside. "Stop trying to love perfectly," she said. Her voice was rough at the edges. "Just love me honestly. That's all I've ever needed. Just honesty." He looked at her. The thunder came again closer. "I don't want you to go," he said. "Not because of the ranch. Not because of the coalition or the legal fight or any of it. I don't want you to go because this house is not the same without you in it, and I am not the same, and I stopped being willing to pretend otherwise somewhere around the 2nd week of December." She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were wet, and she wasn't hiding it. "I'm scared," she said. "I know," he said. "Me too. Both of us terrified. We covered this." Something cracked in her face, that same expression from the kitchen weeks ago. The one that was grief and humor and recognition all at once. "We did," she said. "Didn't we?" "Come inside," he said. "It's going to rain." She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she uncrossed her arms. "Your fault if I catch cold," she said. "I'll take the blame," he said. They went inside together, and the storm broke over the ranch in full, and the bag by her door stayed where it was, and in the morning she put it back in the wardrobe and didn't take it out again. The morning after the storm was the kind of morning that made Wyoming look like it was apologizing for everything it had put you through. The air was clean and sharp, and the sky was the particular blue that only existed after a hard rain had wrung all the gray out of it, and the ranch felt different. Not physically. Nothing had moved. But the quality of the silence was different, the way silence is always different after something significant has been said and heard and answered. Clara was already in the kitchen when Elias came down. She had coffee ready and eggs on the stove, and her back was to him when he came in, and neither of them said good morning right away. They didn't need to. The morning had already been said the night before in a yard with a storm coming in. The only language that had ever worked between them, plain, honest, costly truth. He poured his coffee. He sat down. She set the eggs in front of him and sat across the table. They ate. They talked about the fence line on the north quarter that needed checking after the rain. They talked about the coalition meeting scheduled for Friday. They talked about whether Pete Calloway was ready to take on a crew lead role now that they needed the extra management capacity. Ordinary things, ranch things, the furniture of a shared life. But underneath all of it, something had settled. Something that had been vibrating for months at a frequency just below comfortable had finally gone still. Not silent, still. The way a river goes still in certain deep places, not because it's stopped moving, but because it has found its proper level. Hector came in from the yard at 7:30 and looked at the two of them at the kitchen table and looked at his coffee and said nothing at all, which for Hector was the most eloquent thing he was capable of. He marked the date in his journal with 3 asterisks. Then he thought about it and added a 4th. The coalition meeting on Friday brought 6 of the 7 neighboring ranchers to Elias's dining room, the large room that had now in the space of a few months been transformed from an echoing unused space into a working room with papers on the table and coffee going, and Clara moving between the kitchen and the room with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that a fed, caffeinated man is a more cooperative man than a hungry, cold one. Corbin was among them. He came in, shook Elias's hand, looked around, spotted Clara, and said, "Miss Vale, good to see you again. Not your woman, not your girl, just her name. The way you addressed a person of standing." Clara nodded at him with the measured courtesy she extended to everyone. "Mr. Corbin." Elias caught her eye for a fraction of a second. She gave him nothing readable back. But there was something in the corner of her mouth barely there gone before it was certain that told him she'd noticed. He ran the meeting with the same economy he ran everything. The joint filing was complete. Theodore Marsh had confirmed that the Federal Land Office had received it and assigned it to a senior assessor rather than a territorial one, which was a significant procedural win. It took the case out of the jurisdiction where Whitmore had his existing relationships. The 7 ranches together represented an argument about water rights territorial settlement history and the integrity of the original land grant process that was considerably harder to dismiss than any single claim. "What's Galt doing?" asked a rancher named Farlow. "Quiet," Elias said, "which means he's either accepted that this is going to cost more than he has, or he's planning something different." "What kind of different?" Farlow said. Clara from the doorway. "The kind where he tries to get at least one of you to sell before the inquiry closes." Every head in the room turned. She met the collective attention without flinching. "If even one property in the corridor sells to the syndicate before April 20th, it changes the contour of the whole argument. It gives them an established foothold and makes the joint filing look like resistance to progress rather than defense of legal title." Silence. "She's right," Elias said. "Nobody sells. Nobody even entertains an offer. Any approach from any representative of the Whitmore Syndicate, you send word to me immediately." The ranchers exchanged looks. Farlow nodded slowly. Corbin said, "Agreed." The meeting wrapped in an hour and a half. As the men filed out, Corbin paused beside Elias at the door and said quietly enough that it wasn't performance. "Smart woman. You'd be a fool to let her go." Elias looked at him for a moment. "I'm aware of that," he said. Corbin nodded, put on his hat, and left. Chag. The approach came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before the inquiry deadline. It didn't come to Elias. It came to Clara. She was in town with Alma, same as she'd been a dozen times before getting supplies from the mercantile, when a man she didn't recognize came up beside her at the counter. Well-dressed, smooth, the particular smoothness of a man who had spent years making difficult conversations feel casual. He introduced himself as a representative of a land development interest and said he understood she was employed at the Boone Ranch, and that he wondered if she might pass along a message to Mr. Boone regarding a private offer that might resolve the current legal matter to everyone's satisfaction. Clara looked at him. She said, "I'll pass along your name. The rest you can say to him directly, or say to his attorney, Mr. Marsh in Laramie." The man smiled the smile of someone recalibrating. The offer would be quite favorable to Mr. Boone, considerably above assessed value. "Your name," Clara said. He gave it. She repeated it back to him to make sure she had it correctly, which she did, and then she picked up her supply order and walked out to where Alma was waiting with the wagon. Alma looked at her. Who was that? Someone who thought talking to the woman was easier than talking to the man, Clara said. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. He was wrong about that. Elias was at the north fence when she rode back. He saw her coming across the field, and something in the set of her posture told him before she said a word that something had happened. She told him. All of it, every word in the order it happened. No embellishment, no drama, just the clean facts. His jaw tightened progressively as she spoke. By the end of it, the tightness had moved into his eyes, not anger exactly. The cold, focused version of it that got things done. He thought you'd be easier, Elias said. Men like that always think that, she said. They're usually right about other women. They were wrong about me. He looked at her on her horse dirt on her coat, completely unbothered by what had just happened. Because she had handled it, and it was handled, and he thought there is no version of my life I want to live where this woman is not part of it. He said, I'm sending a letter to Marsh tonight. This constitutes attempted circumvention of the formal process it goes into the record. I thought it would, she said. I made sure I had his name right. You thought of that in the moment, he said. I thought of it before the moment, she said. Anyone willing to approach a third party is likely to try it more than once. Better to have a name documented. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, in something that was closer to wonder. Go send the letter, she said. I'll finish the fence check. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. Go. He went. She finished the fence check. And later, when Hector asked how the North Quarter looked, she gave him a complete and accurate report that took him 3 minutes to absorb and left him with nothing to add. He wrote in his journal, She's running half this ranch and doesn't notice she's doing it. He notices. Gek. The inquiry closed on April 20th. The ruling came back from the Federal Land Office on May 3rd, and Elias read it at his desk while Clara was in the garden. The real garden now planted, growing the first visible green of it, coming up through the Wyoming soil, like an argument against every hard winter the land had ever delivered. He read the ruling twice. Then he went outside. She was kneeling in the dirt, checking the progress of the herb seedlings she'd started inside and transferred out the week before. She looked up when she heard him coming, read his face, and stood up. Well, she said. Clean title confirmed, he said. All 7 properties. The inquiry is closed. The syndicate's filing has been formally dismissed as procedurally defective, which is the federal way of saying the records they relied on don't hold up under direct scrutiny. She let out a breath. And Galt? Overextended on a bet that didn't pay, Elias said. He'll spend the next 5 years clawing his way out of what this cost him. Is that satisfying? She asked. He thought about it honestly. Less than I expected, he said. Mostly I just feel done with it. She nodded. She understood that. The end of a long fight rarely felt like triumph. Mostly it just felt like the lifting of weight you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. The garden's doing well, he said, looking at it. Better than I expected this early, she said. The barn wall holds heat better than I thought it would. He looked at the small, careful rows of green she'd coaxed out of ground that had never grown anything but stubbornness. He thought about the day she'd started clearing it in January, in the frozen cold, with a hand spade and a plan that extended months into a future she had every reason to be uncertain about. You always intended to stay, he said. She looked at the garden. I intended to plant something, she said. Whether I stayed depended on a lot of things. On me, he said. She glanced at him sideways. Among other things. What were the other things? Whether I could be myself here, she said. Whether the work meant something. Whether the quiet was the right kind. She paused. Whether the man was worth the risk of caring about him. And, he said. She almost smiled. The garden's still growing, she said. Draw your own conclusions. It was Alma who finally said it out loud. Not to Elias, not to Clara. To Hector in the kitchen on a Saturday morning, in the particular frank way of people who have been married long enough to have stopped performing for each other. He's going to ask her, Alma said. Soon. He's been carrying it around for 3 weeks. How do you know? Hector said. Same way I know everything in this house, Alma said. Because I pay attention. Think she'll say yes, Hector said. Alma considered this with genuine seriousness, the way she considered things that mattered. I think she'll ask him a question first, she said. She always does, to make sure he means it. And then she'll say yes, Alma said. Because that woman has been in love with him since January, and she'd never admit it, but the garden's been growing all spring, and she keeps finding reasons to stay in the same rooms he's in, and I have eyes. Hector picked up his coffee cup. I have a journal entry from February that says basically the same thing. I know you do, Alma said. I've read it. Alma, you leave it on the kitchen table, she said, without a trace of apology. Elias asked her on a Thursday in May in the late afternoon beside the garden, not because Thursday had any significance, not because he'd planned it for that particular day. He'd been planning it in the loose, careful way he planned things that mattered enormously for several weeks. He had thought about how to say it. He had rejected every version that involved ceremony or speeches because none of them sounded like himself. And the whole point, the only point that had ever been the point between them, was honesty. So when it happened simply. He'd come from the barn. She was checking on the herb rows, same as she did most evenings. He came and stood beside her. They looked at the garden together for a moment, in the way they'd come to look at it as something that belonged to both of them, though it had started as hers. He said, "The east room on the second floor." She looked at him. "What about it?" "It's the biggest room in the house," he said. "Good light in the morning. It's been used for storing extra tack for 15 years, and that's a waste." "What would you use it for?" she said. He looked at her directly. "Whatever you need it to be," he said. "If you want a writing room. Or for plants in winter when the garden's frozen. Or for nothing, just a room that's yours. Whatever a person needs who is intending to be somewhere for the rest of her life." Clara went very still. He said, "I'm not good at this. You know I'm not good at this." "I know," she said. "I don't have a speech," he said. I've thought about how to say this for a month, and everything I came up with sounds like someone else saying it." "Then don't say someone else's version," she said quietly. "Say yours." He looked at her, at the dirt on her hands, and the green behind her, and the Wyoming sky going gold over the mountains, and this woman who had walked in from a blizzard and never quite walked back out. "Stay," he said. "Not because you need somewhere to be. Not because the ranch needs running or the coalition needed someone to write down names or any of it. Stay because you choose me, and I choose you, and that's the whole of what I'm asking." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was keeping something contained. "I have a question," she said. "I know," he said. "Ask it. If I wake up one morning and I'm unhappy about something, if something between us goes wrong, and I need to say so, will you hear me?" "Yes," he said. Not quickly, deliberately. "Even if it's about you," she said. "Especially if it's about me," he said. "And if I need something you don't understand, yet something you have to learn how to give. Will you try?" "I'll do more than try," he said. "I'll ask you what it looks like, so I know what I'm aiming for." She pressed her lips together. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were absolutely full. "Then yes," she said. "I choose you. Obviously, I choose you. I've been choosing you since January, and I've been trying very hard not to notice." Something went through him, not relief, not triumph. Something quieter and more permanent than either. Like a door opening that he hadn't known was sealed. "Good," he said. "That's settled." She laughed, sudden genuine, the laugh that came out of her when something was genuinely funny, and she'd given up managing it. "That's your response? Good," That's settled. I'm not a speeches man, he said. I know, she said. I love that about you. It was the first time either of them had said the word directly, not framed in fear or wrapped in qualification, just said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The garden grew around them steady and green and rooted, and neither of them looked away. The wedding was in June. Small, honest, exactly what both of them were. The ranch hands stood in their best clothes, which for Pete Calloway meant a shirt without visible holes, and for Hector meant the good hat he saved for significant occasions. Alma cried before the ceremony started, and maintained that she was not crying, and that it was allergies, a claim that convinced no one. The circuit preacher came out from town. The ceremony was short because Elias had told him plainly that neither he nor Clara had patience for theater, and that the legal and genuine parts were sufficient. When it was done, and the preacher had said what needed to be said, Clara turned to Elias, and he looked at her, this woman in a simple dress, with her hands that were never entirely without dirt, and her eyes that had never in all the months he'd known her said anything they didn't mean. And he thought about 8 years of fortress and 11 women, and one long letter from a woman who left in the mud of March 1874, and all the walls he'd built, and all the evenings he'd sat in a room large enough for a family, and eaten alone, and told himself the quiet was a choice. He thought about a stormy November night, and a bay horse, and a worn canvas coat, and a woman who didn't flinch. He thought all of it led here. He did not say any of that. He was not a speeches man. But Clara looked at him, and she saw it, all of it, the same way she'd seen him since the beginning, through the walls, and past the fortress, and straight into whatever was actually there. And she squeezed his hand once firmly, and he understood that she knew. By autumn, the house had changed. Not structurally. The bones of it were the same walls, same rooms, same enormous fireplace, same long dining table that had spent years serving one man in silence. But the bones were no longer what you noticed. You noticed the sound of two people in a kitchen in the morning talking about ordinary things. You noticed muddy boots beside the door in pairs. You noticed the east room upstairs, which had been emptied and given over to Clara's winter plants, and the books she was slowly accumulating, and occasionally a draft of a letter to one of the coalition ranchers about grazing policy, because Clara had opinions about grazing policy, and had discovered that people listened to them. You noticed the garden, which had grown through a full Wyoming summer, and been harvested and put up for winter and left the following season's ground better than it found it. You noticed, if you came to supper at the Boone Ranch, that the table was full. Not with strangers, with the people who had built something together, who had worked through a hard year and come out the other side with their hands still on what mattered. Elias was different. Not unrecognizable. Still direct. Still demanding. Still the man who had built 30,000 acres out of nothing with his own stubborn hands. But the coldness was gone. Not replaced with softness, replaced with something that required more from him than coldness ever had. Openness. Presence. The daily deliberate choice to stay in the room even when the room got difficult. Clara was different too. Larger than she'd arrived, not physically, but in the way she occupied her own life. Her voice in a room carried. Her opinions landed. She didn't apologize for existing in a space, and she didn't make herself convenient, and she didn't disappear, and every day that she didn't was its own quiet victory over everything that had tried to shrink her. They argued sometimes. Real arguments, not the brittle performed kind, where someone is managing rather than engaging, but the kind that happened between two people who trusted each other enough to be fully present in a disagreement. And then they talked through it, the way they'd always talked, directly, honestly, with the specific respect of people who know what it cost to find someone worth the effort of working things out. Hector wrote in his journal on a December evening in their first year of marriage, watching them at the kitchen table from the doorway. He laughs now. I'd forgotten what that sounded like. He closed the journal. He went to find Alma. Years later, a new ranch hand, young, barely 20, hired on in the spring, asked Pete Calloway about the boss, about who he was and how he ran things, and whether the stories you heard in town were true. Pete thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved. Which stories? He said. The ones about how he used to be, the young man said. Cold, wouldn't let anyone in, turned away every woman who ever came calling. Pete was quiet for a moment. Those stories are true, he said. Or they were. Before. Before what? The young man asked. Pete looked across the yard to where Clara was coming out of the barn, brushing hay off her coat, calling something back over her shoulder to Elias, who was still inside, and answered in the particular voice he used only with her, the one that had no edge to it, the one that meant something that none of them had a precise word for, but all of them recognized. Before she came through the gate, Pete said. In a blizzard, with nothing. The young man looked. She changed him. Pete shook his head slowly. No, he said. She didn't change him. She stayed beside him until he opened the door himself. That's different. He picked up his tools and went back to work. And on the other side of the yard, Clara Vale. Clara Boone walked back toward the house she had planted a garden beside and chosen to stay in and made into a home for two people who had both been certain for a long time that they had forgotten how, and she was not afraid of what came next. She had learned in the hard way that real learning always happens, that survival and living were not the same thing. That silence could be peace, or it could be prison, and the difference was whether you chose it. That love built on honesty was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind that asked you to keep showing up, keep telling the truth, keep choosing the person across from you on the ordinary days when no storm was coming and no crisis required anyone to be brave. It was, she had discovered, the only kind worth having. And the cold cowboy who had rejected every bride and built his walls so high that the sky beyond them had shrunk to a manageable strip, that man had turned out to be underneath all of it, someone who simply needed to be loved without being asked to be someone other than himself. And that was exactly what she had given him. And it had been enough. It had been more than enough. It had been everything.